Greetings and welcome to the Pandemic Podcast, where tonight we ask the question, can we believe any of the COVID numbers? This is a topic over the course of 200 to 300 episodes we've addressed in different ways, but I'm delighted to be bringing Professor Norman Fenton to the show to discuss this tonight. Now, the entire COVID-19 pandemic response has been driven by the numbers that we see over and over again in the media. And from the start, back in March 2020, we've been bombarded with statistics, apparently primarily aimed at keeping us as confused as possible and in a sustained state of fear, it seems. Now, very few academics have been as outspoken as my guest today, who not only dared to raise his head above the parapet early on, but also continues to speak out regularly against what he sees as the blatant manipulation of data. Professor Norman Fenton is a mathematician who is a professor of risk information management at the Queen Mary University of London. He's also a chartered engineer and a fellow of the British Computing Society, and he specialises in using Bayesian risk statistical methods to challenge data and predict probabilities. And despite academic media censorship, has applied his methods to numbers and consistently found them wanting. He was one of the skids at the last month's lockdown summit in London, and this week he wearily tweeted, "I've come to the conclusion that we cannot trust any of the official statistics driving the COVID-19 narrative." So tonight we're going to unpack what Professor Fenton's discovered during his 19-month interrogation of official figures and what he believes we need to do in order to find out what's really going on. So Norman, great to have you on the show again.
Well, thanks for having me on, yeah. And thanks for all the work that you're doing.
Oh, yeah, it's non-stop. It's non-stop. Apologies to our audience for the delay tonight. We had a slight technical issue before we got started. I'd like to start by asking you, many of us have paid real close attention to what's been going on over the last 18 months. What piqued your attention? What got you to look at the data early on in 2020?
Well, I mean, when COVID first struck in 2020, we were as concerned as everybody, after seeing images out of China and Italy, for example. I mean, I didn't know then that the images of young people dropping dead on the streets of Wuhan were likely faked. But, we looked at the publicly available case and fatality data to get an understanding of the seriousness and trajectory of the problem. But unlike others, we applied these causal probabilistic models to better understand and explain the data and to determine the real risk. I mean, that's basically what we do in terms of our research. It's not just me, there's a team of people I work with at Queen Mary. Now, initially, we found that very different case and fatality rates between similar neighbouring countries could largely be explained by very simple causal explanations, such as, for example, different amounts of testing done and the different classifications of what constituted a COVID case and a COVID death. So, for example, initially in the UK, the only people at the beginning who were really being tested and classified as a COVID case were those who were actually already hospitalised with serious symptoms. And that meant that the population infection rate was being underestimated, while the infection fatality rate was being overestimated. So we published articles then in peer-reviewed journals about this and related issues, which were not considered in any way controversial. Because, in fact, we argue that to get the true infection and fatality rates, there had to be widespread random testing. And that turned out to be something that subsequently did happen. But ironically, I now believe that's been the biggest mistake of all. And obviously, I'll come back to that later on. Now, I should say we also developed, uncontroversial. We did, lots of other uncontroversial research in the COVID data space. So, for example, we developed a COVID self-assessment tool that took account of multiple causal factors. We did research on claims about risks to people of different ethnicities. So, for example, we found that this was maybe the first indication of where there was sort of concerns about the narrative. We found that the widely publicised government Office for National Statistics data, which claimed that BAME, i.e. black and minority ethnic people, were over 4 times likely to die than whites, was massively exaggerated, and that was causing unnecessary fear within the BAME community.
Right. So you when you started looking at this early on, was there any controversy around these things that you were looking at, or in the because a lot of people who are essentially looking for or who have found issues with the data have obviously come under scrutiny. But what was the response to these initial findings?
Well, the thing was, I mean, we'd already found, as I say, about May, June 2020, that the case fatality rate was much lower than originally assumed. And so I thought it was increasingly strange that, that the government was using very simplistic case numbers to drive policy decisions at that time, like lockdowns, without any kind of cost benefit analysis. And I also thought it was strange that anybody considered to have COVID within 28 days of death was classified as a COVID death, even if the cause was something else. So these were kind of originally, about when did I sort of first smell a COVID rat? These are sort of things that came up. But the thing that really triggered me was when I found out about the extent of the flaws of the PCR testing and the fact that the whole narrative was based around equating a COVID case, with a positive PCR test rather than, with somebody being ill with COVID symptoms. And the problem was in September of 2020, there was a massive increase in testing, but the public was only being shown the rising case number curves. This was the, part of the kind of like the Project Fear. And this was used, those increasing curves were used to justify the new lockdowns that happened around that time. And there was no consideration given to the massively increased number of people being tested. Now, in particular, it was clear that there was now widespread testing of asymptomatic people, i.e. basically healthy people. Yes. And there was little acknowledgement that most of these were false positives. And alarm bells were really ringing when I saw that the COVID triage data, which includes like 999 and 111 calls, which really did spike massively for the initial pandemic in March and April, were actually showing fairly normal seasonal rates and fluctuations in contrast to these massively increasing case curves. And then, I was suspicious of what data was actually being hidden from us that the government must have known. So why was there no separate data on asymptomatic and symptomatic cases? Why was there no data on how many symptomatic cases go on to develop symptoms? Why was there no information on PCR test accuracy? Why was there no confirmatory testing of asymptomatic cases? I mean, later on, when we did a study of asymptomatics based on the Cambridge data, we found that 36 out of 43 PCR positive cases were actually found to be false when they retested the same samples. Why was the WHO continually changing its policies, including the definition of what herd immunity was? It seemed that they were doing that at that time to promote vaccines as the only method of achieving it. And then more recently, why try to force vaccination on people like children whose risks of serious illness from COVID is less than the risk of the adverse reaction? And also on those who are immune to having had, are immune because they've had COVID-19. And I guess the final point relating to that, which is mystifying me, is why is it impossible in the UK, even if you want to pay privately, to get an antibody test to determine immunity?
I mean, you've kind of reeled off, point by point, some of the critical flaws in the data. There's a couple of things I'd like to explore around this point, because firstly, I feel like it's almost become normalized. There's a phrase that I've used several times in my life, which is what you permit, you promote. And we've almost permitted the use of these flawed analysis. It's been permeated throughout the media. The government haven't been held to account on using these things. No questions have been asked. And even to this day, I never run out of things to talk about on the podcast because I've got such a long list of unanswered questions. And the reality is there's certain data that I just can't get my hands on to make any sense of this. And if it suddenly landed on my shoulders to navigate how we move out of this, I wouldn't have the dashboard that I needed. I can't run my business without data to run my business, but somehow 18 months or 19 months later, we're still, quote unquote, managing or running the pandemic response without real data. I mean, your quote at the end of the talk at the lockdown summit it made the room chuckle, but it was a sad fact. You asked, what do these four things have in common? How many cases have there been? How many hospitalizations have there been? How many deaths have there been? And there was a question around vaccines, and you basically said, we have no idea. We have no idea. And that's a sad state of affairs, don't you think?
Yeah, because ultimately it's all driven through the testing, in particular the PCR testing. A case is a positive test, right? And that applies, as you said, because that applies, as you said, to whether someone's infected, whether they've got the virus, whether they've hospitalized with the virus, or whether they die with the virus. So all those key graphs that they show, it's all driven by this definition of a case being a positive test. And because because of this failure to distinguish, or at least to provide us with the data that distinguishes between symptomatic and asymptomatics who test positive, we really do have no idea about what those figures really are. In fact, we don't know how many people are actually, currently ill with COVID symptoms or have been ill with COVID symptoms. We don't know, for example, how many of the people who are hospitalized but classified as COVID, or deaths as classified as COVID, are with COVID, i.e. with a positive test, rather than for some other, rather than because of some other cause. We're not given information, for example, on those who are hospitalized and die. We're not given information on whether or not they've got serious comorbidities. I think some of that data is in place scattered in different places, but it's not easily accessible. And I think that the problems is especially acute when it comes to children, because they actually constitute the bulk of asymptomatic cases due to their mass testing for school. So if we look, if you look at, again, what's the data available on this? What do we know? Well, for a start, if you go to the government, the ONS, Office of National Statistics website, data for this, you've got these oversimplified age classifications. So, for example, they classify under 1, between 1 and 14 years, and then 15 to 44. So if you wanted to get information on school children, you can't, because some of the all the sixth formers and some of the fifth formers are classified with those young adults, in fact young to middle age adults, which is pretty bizarre. So we don't know if what we do know, incidentally, actually, is that the death numbers from other sources, the death numbers even over the whole pandemic for children, are essentially zero, right? So I'll give some justification for that. So in the report, let's say up until in the first 12 months, right, there were only 25 under 18s in the UK classified as COVID deaths. And around 15 of those had life-limiting underlying conditions. And that includes 13 who were living with complex neurodisabilities. In fact, only six had no recently recorded underlying major health conditions. And even then, the research on this, they were cautioning people that didn't necessarily mean that they could have had illnesses which were missed. And just looking at the more recent data, when there's been the recent uptick in cases and deaths, in fact, quite a significant uptick in cases for children. If you look at the report dated, the most recent report, 20th of August, zero deaths in children up to 14 years. But the number of infections is actually highest in that age category. So it's all completely meaningless. And in terms of people say, but what about hospitalizations? In the whole of the first year, because I haven't got the data since, only 251 children, that is under the 18 and under, were admitted to ICU, and most of those had some underlying health condition.
That's that for me. And again, even that number, Norman, from what you said, is based upon someone who's tested positive and subsequently arrived in hospital. So it still doesn't tell us if they were admitted due to COVID or other causes, for other treatment.
Exactly.
Frighteningly, this is a really important topic around children because the schools are going back next week, and quite frankly, I've seen all over the social media. You've got two groups of parents who are essentially talking about dragging their kids out of school or stopping them from going back. One is the ones that are petrified still of COVID because, of course, they've seen all of this infection information, the outlier situations perpetually through the summer. So naturally, they're petrified to send their children back based upon what the media has presented to them. And then you've got the issues surrounding the vaccines, which another group of parents are worried because they've been told that consent may not be required. So all in all, we've got these poor children in the middle who education has already been decimated in the last 18 months. Their mental health is there's a mental health crisis within young people. And all of this is because we've got, in my view, a distinct lack of sound public health information. Because everyone seems to think that even smart people, Norman, smart people in your field of expertise who study risks seem to treat, now we'll come on to ask you about that in a minute, but seem to treat that every case is equal, that it comes with equal risk, and every member of the population comes with equal risk. Now, you're a professor in risk information management. What perception? Does COVID offer equal risk to all beings?
No, it absolutely. I mean, it absolutely doesn't. I mean, we know that we know the risk to children is essentially negligible, which is why there's this whole the issue of the the concerns there. It's about the parents. The whole vaccination for children issue is a particular concern. We have to from the true risk perspective, we actually have a very good idea of who is at most risk, and therefore who the benefits of the vaccine outweigh the risk. So that there isn't any the people who have looked at risk, and there are, let's say, more prominent people than me who've done that, but who kind of like a part of the establishment know this, but are still not making the case that that you've just made and that I'm supporting about equating all cases as being equal.
I mean, that's just but that's what petrifies people. You and I have both had the virus. You were suffering with it when you spoke at the lockdown summit. We're both here alive and well, thankfully. But people said to me, my mother said to me, you're one of the lucky ones. It's like, no, statistically, I'm experiencing exactly what I was expected to experience, because majority people my age don't get severe illness, they don't become hospitalized, and they certainly don't die. But there are people in my friendship group who still believe that they're the ones that are at risk. Now, of course, there's always exceptions, Norman, as there is with every illness, every form of illness or disease. And there are people within my age range that certainly do have pre-existing conditions, absolutely. And that's a different story. But we seem to be managing for risk for the exception rather than the norm. Would you say that?
And people have the misperceptions of that risk, as you say. I mean, as you said, one of the things that we picked up on, early on, irrespective actually of the different age classifications, generally the infection fatality rate, i.e. the probability of dying if you are genuinely infected, was exaggerated. I mean, it's very low. And yet, there's been public studies. Even intelligent people seem to think, if you get the virus, and you're, let's say, your age, Dan, they seem to think there's a 15%, there's a 10 to 15%, even clever people, there's a 10 to 15% chance that you're going to die, and it's simply massively overstated. We know that, but that perception is there because of the whole kind of like propaganda, the Project Fear, the propaganda of fear that's been, absolutely dominated the media narrative.
No, absolutely. And the thing that frightens me most is obviously this has been happening now for 18, 19 months. Almost everything has been put on hold to manage COVID-19. It's been placed upon this warlike footing where nothing else matters. And, I said it countless times. I said it on my interview on Talk Radio this week.
that you can't protect the entire forest by just saving one tree, but it seems like everything else doesn't matter anymore. But despite that myopic focus, where every aspect is under the microscope with the COVID-19, almost daily the figures are getting published and presented in some form. Despite that myopic focus, intense single topic focus, we've still got all of these issues with the data, which make it almost, I believe, impossible to understand what's really happening. What's led to this egregious distortion of data?
Well, I mean, I think that there is. I think that there's a political narrative behind it. I don't know how much that we should get into that, but what can I say? I mean, there's this whole, if for example, you mention, I mean, let's put it like this. When I was shocked when I was first on a panel, an academic COVID panel discussing the COVID crisis in the summer of 2020. I mean, people talk about conspiracy theory, but actually, the first time I ever heard about the World Economic Forum's Great Reset agenda was it came from the other academics at that meeting, right? So in fact, all the other academics on that panel spoke about the COVID crisis being the perfect opportunity for a great reset, which they felt was necessary to usher in a new, improved world order, and especially to combat what they saw as the greatest existential threat to the world, which was namely climate change. And they were very happy with the lockdowns because they said it was already leading to reduced carbon emissions and cleaner air. And they all wanted ongoing travel restrictions because they said, we mustn't return to the old normal. And that build back better narrative is to me, it's about, more about global governance and control, especially over travel. And I think that, there are many academics who are openly suggesting that COVID lockdowns are a necessary precursor for climate lockdowns. And I think it's important to note that such academics not only dominate the government scientific advisory committee, but are also, on the editorial boards of journals, etc. And therefore, they're let's say exaggerating the scale of the problem. Coming back to your question, why there's nothing been done about it? Why is this oversimplistic, case-driven, message going out? I think it fits well. That it kind of fits in well with that narrative and agenda.
Well, there's a well-known phrase which is "never let a good crisis go to waste," and there's certainly a lot of powerful forces and influences being very opportunistic with what we've seen in the last 18 months and continue to be, and that's an entire big web of things to unpack. I've called it like the yarn ball because there's so many groups and individuals that have kind of jumped on this as a real opportunity to drive these different agendas and narratives. But surely within the profession, those who deal with data day on day within different sectors, different areas of expertise, surely it doesn't take long. I mean, I studied economics with advanced statistics, econometrics. I've got a good grip on numbers. I spent close to eight years in financial services, so very experienced dealing with numbers. It didn't take me very long to notice there was a problem. And, reading the PHE reports early on, reading the protocols for categorizing mortality, it was very clear. I mean, I remember seeing the very first PHE report which was designed to give guidance to public health professionals on how to categorize mortality. And I read that document cover to cover, and I thought, we are going to have a nightmare. This is going to be an absolute nightmare. We will never know the true extent of the burden of disease. We'll never truly understand who actually died from the virus rather than being exposed to a virus. We'll never know because it will become the most statistically challenging the failure to postmortem, the failure to have postmortems and autopsies on the human body is one problem, but to try and have a postmortem or autopsy of the data is an even bigger problem because of it. I called that in 2020, March 2020 last year, and here we are now with the same issue. We genuinely don't know how many people have died from this virus, do we?
No, we don't. And why you think why aren't more academics clamoring for the data and doing the data analysis, right? As I said, it's because I think they're scared. They're scared of destroying. I think if you do find out the kind of data we've been looking for, again, it will confirm, my suspicions that the scale of the problem has been exaggerated in order to fit into this sort of, build back better narrative, right? But what I don't understand, I have to say, like you, is that, if you think about it, historically, academics are supposed to be the ones who question the official narrative, who dig deep into this, right? They're the ones who are supposed to reject, and in particular, they're the ones also would be especially doing this because they would naturally reject infringements of civil liberties and government interventions, especially when those interventions most adversely affect the poorest in society. So everything, in a sense, is geared, you think, towards academics, vast numbers of academics, absolutely demanding the kind of data that we're speaking about and analysing that data. But they don't. They're not. There's a handful of us, and they attempt to delegitimise us. It's actually academic. The thing is, it's academics who've actually been the key drivers of the hysterical narrative to support lockdowns. In fact, they're the ones who are basically pushing the narrative for even harsher restrictions like the COVID passports. And the most bizarre thing of all is that the academics' only objections to government policy, these prominent academics, the ones who actually get the media attention, their only objections to government policy is that the government haven't been strict enough in the restrictions and the control. They want more government control, more restrictions, harder, longer, etc. That's what I say, but it sounds bizarre until you look at what I said are those underlying motivations, which is that, apart from the political ones, there's a lot of academics, especially those ones advising the government, who buy into that political narrative of the Great Reset, and they've been absolutely clear about it themselves. People call me a conspiracy theorist for saying that, but they were the ones who told me about it. These were the people, they were saying it themselves, right? But the other thing is, think about other things. All the people who, it's not just academics, it's the civil servants as well, but all of the people who are continually pushing for the restrictions based on these sort of flawed statistics are completely unaffected by the negative consequences of those decisions. They basically got no skin in the game. Right. In contrast to like independent workers and small business owners, many of whom lost their whole livelihoods, during the lockdowns, not one academic will lose a single day's pay. And in fact, for many, their lives are actually made easier by being able to work from home because they're a privileged elite who typically have, large, comfortable homes with gardens. So, they've got that, there's a personal interest as well from them in sustaining this narrative.
Yeah, well, yeah. Lizzie and I, during the first lockdown, we lived in quite a nice part of the city, and you hear all the champagne corks popping, the corks popping on a sunny day. Loads of people were taking, it's a bliss for some people, and if you look at any of the data around job dissatisfaction, which is probably even that's probably underestimated. That's probably in that case probably underestimated. But there's people who are so dissatisfied with their own jobs and their careers that actually having paid time off in the sunshine during the first lockdown was probably bliss. You're absolutely right. Propagates the story. So we know that a lot of academics have failed to put their heads above the parapet. We've also seen a lot of censorship I'd like to talk about in a moment, but could you've been able to publish a number of papers throughout the last months. Could you just kind of summarize some of the things that you've been able to publish?
So the things that we were able to publish, which were published in peer-reviewed journals, was the stuff on the need for causal models to explain the observed data that we were getting, and in turn using that data to get better, more accurate estimates of the population infection rate and the case fatality rate. We published papers on the ethnic minorities, the impact, the different risk to the ethnic minorities. All of that we had no problem with. We didn't go for a peer-reviewed journal, but we got the web app and we got published on Archive and MedArchive, all the stuff on the COVID self-assessment stuff. So all of that, I say, that was kind of like considered non-controversial, right? But as soon as I started to basically report on my blog and on my Twitter the serious concerns about the PCR false positives and the over-testing of asymptomatics, which I believe was creating a flawed narrative for more lockdowns, that's when not just the censorship started, but also the personal attacks. And in fact, I've never had, despite the fact that we've put out multiple reports since, right, on various issues about the case data since then, the flaw, what are the flaws in it, and all of the stuff on false positives, right? We've had nothing published since. Now, initially, it was when I first started doing the kind of like the Twitter posts about that. I started to get abusive kind of like postings about me on Twitter, and quite a lot of people were sort of tagging Queen Mary University, demanding that I be sacked and stuff like that. And many people, many people were also reporting me to Twitter as a spreader of lies and misinformation to try and get my account closed down. Now, they didn't actually succeed in doing that, but they did succeed in getting restrictions on my account, such as shadow banning, whereby only followers can generally see my tweets. And I mean, the whole thing was all very strange because, the idea was very strange to me to discover there were actually people out there who spend the whole of their time trying to investigate and discredit me, right? Which is a kind of like a weird feeling. But where it really turned even worse was when I exposed the statistical flaws in the government messaging about 1 in 3 people with the virus having no symptoms. So we did an extensive piece of research on that, which was backed up by this study of asymptomatics at Cambridge University. We used all of the publicly available information data from them and the ONS statistics at the time on the case data. And we basically proved that message, which has and still kind of like dominates the media, create enormous fear, that was an absolute piece of propaganda, right? I mean, while it may well be true that 1 in 3 people who test positive have no symptoms, in fact, it's probably even higher proportion. This idea that 1 in 3 people who actually have the virus and are ill, people who have the virus have no symptoms, right, is completely bogus, right? Now, despite the fact that our paper was a rigorous Bayesian statistical analysis of that, and the statistics and our method has never been challenged, it was rejected immediately from all the major journals without review. I mean, for example, the BMJ said that the subject matter, despite the fact that this was like the big message of the time, they said the subject matter was of no interest. And that was despite the fact that I had a video I posted about it on YouTube, which actually got over 70,000 views in a few days. But even more alarmingly, and incredible to my view, and this is something which has continued, the two major preprint servers, which are a thing called Archive for general statistical and mathematical papers, and MedArchive for medically related papers, both of those preprint servers, which people actually use to instantly post unreviewed research of this type, simply to get feedback and just sort of put it out there to the community. It doesn't go through a review process. It's normally, as long as it's not obviously plagiarized, if it goes, I think they do some sort of an automatic check to see if it's plagiarized or fraudulent. As long as it isn't, it gets published. No questions. Those servers actually rejected our papers without any obvious explanation. And they've rejected, here's the thing, We've done several since. They've rejected every single thing that we've submitted on COVID since. And in particular, of course, things have actually got worse because we started this year to produce reports which actually challenge the official narrative on both vaccine effectiveness and treatments. So, for example, we looked at the massive study from Israel, which got about the Pfizer vaccine, which got enormous widespread press because it claimed that tested on, at that point, I think it was an observational study of like several million people, and it was shown to be 95% effective, right? But we identified that was published at the beginning of May, right? Now, we identified some obvious flaws in that study and wrote it up, which actually meant that the effectiveness was significantly low. I mean, it was still effective, so I don't know why they were sort of covering it up, right? But it was low. It was significantly lower. We said, if you, for example, just take an account of the different ways that the inconsistencies in the way testing of vaccinated versus unvaccinated was done. If you account for that, then it comes down to 75% straight away, right? Which is still okay. There's still something to be, to be pleased about. Now, of course, our observation there has turned out to be absolutely true because all of the data in the recent weeks has proven, in Israel alone, where the study came from, that the Pfizer vaccine was far less effective than that 95% claimed in May. Now, we submitted, I think it was about a few days after it was published, so it was early May, we submitted a very short 250-word rapid response letter highlighting the obvious flaws in the study, right? And to this day, so months on, that was to Lancet, it was in the Lancet. So the Lancet published the studies of all these obvious flaws.
Yeah.
We send a rapid response letter, which normally they should normally publish these things because it's not publication. It goes on their letters pages, and that letter has still not been published, and nor have they provided a reason why not. And we've also done, we've got unbelievable, new censorship and also unbelievable hostility. As a result of doing, we used our Bayesian methods to do a kind of a novel review of the data relating to ivermectin, which has been suggested as a cheap, possible, especially early treatment for COVID, right? Now, because our analysis resulted in conclusions which were somewhat positive in favor of ivermectin, we were subject to major abuse, right? And again, censorship. Of course, it got immediately rejected, from the preprint servers. And in terms of the other thing on vaccine, which is quite frightening, is that I played a very minor role in analysing the VARS data, which is the Vaccine Adverse Reaction System data which comes from the US, right? That's their official data. Now, a colleague, a colleague of mine was a main author of that work. Now, as a result of that, he had his Twitter account hacked, and he has been subjected to awful abuse, including a ludicrous hit piece by a BBC documentary producer, which incidentally also included a bizarre attack on me as a person who was, they said, red flag. This is a language that they use for anybody who they disagree with, right? I mean, this whole, and just to give a feel for the extent. Actually, on the subject of hacking, there's one other point. I mean, hacking as a means to delegitimize and censor us on that subject. I think it's well known now, so I can talk about it. The private chat system of the Heart Group, of which I'm a member, was the victim of a sophisticated criminal hacking, which resulted in all the private messages being posted on a public website, right? And the interesting thing is that the only message by me, which has been publicly flagged by our opponents as being incriminating, was one where I simply said that Julia Hartley Brewer had retweeted one of my tweets. And that's apparently that really red flags me as someone who cannot be taken seriously. And I mean, the other thing is that being a member of Heart also gets you labelled as an anti-vaxxer. So bizarrely, well before I'd ever looked into vaccinations at all. The effective vaccinations. I had no interest in looking at that. It was a subject I didn't know, anything about. I was perfectly happy with people being with the vaccine coming out, etc. But the Sunday Times, in a front page article, singled me out as an anti-vaxxer. I say, but I'd never commented on vaccines before, simply because another member of HART wrote a report in which all it did was identify that there'd been a spike in deaths following the first round of vaccinations. In fact, it was because of that, because of being called an anti-vaxxer when I wasn't, that actually spurred me to look at the vaccine data more closely, because I thought, if they're doing this before we've even said anything about it, there's something potentially suspicious going on.
Yeah, smoking gun. Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, it's frightening. I mean, I've laughed through this out of, it's hysterical because it's unbelievable. But at the same time, it's frightening. It's frightening. I mean, personally, and I've said this several times on the podcast, I've always had what I describe as a healthy skepticism of authority. I grew up listening to punk rock music and, had a relatively anti-establishment view as a result. But I've never seen anything like what I've witnessed in the past 18 months that has eroded my trust in institutions, in politics, in science, in media. The event we ran in July was under the banner of Question Everything. Sadly, I feel like I need to go back to first basis and literally question everything. Anything due to the biased media reporting I've seen here on the pandemic. I honestly don't know if I can trust anything I see on the news. I really don't know. And when I say this, I know there are good people in politics. There are good people in media. There are good people in science. Yes, there must be. I hope there is. But they are overshadowed by some very, very powerful forces.
I mean, on that, you've been on some of the anti-COVID restriction demos in London, right? Haven't you?
Of course, yeah. All
exactly. And I've been on. So as people have attended that, we know the size of the crowd, enormous size of those crowds, right? And so we've seen firsthand how the entire mainstream media either completely censored that, or when it was forced to report at all, completely misrepresented it, either in terms of the size of the crowd. So 50 to 100,000 gets turned into a couple of thousand or even a few hundred, and then they misrepresent what it's about by saying it's just an anti-vax demo.
Everything, it always comes back to that. It's the lowest, it's just the lowest common denominator. It's dismiss it because people have already got a negative association with anyone that questioned vaccines. We've said the word vaccine and ivermectin far too many times in this episode. My YouTube account is probably going to get a flag for this episode.
Oh, no.
I may as well call it out live whilst I still can, because that in itself is surely, we haven't made any claims about ivermectin. We haven't made any claims about the vaccines. We're having a discussion around them. Yet it'll probably lead to this episode being taken down. Unfortunately, it's streaming also to Odyssey, which is a channel that isn't subject to the same censorship. But of course, we had 5 million views on the Pandemic Podcast YouTube channel before that was deplatformed completely. I've had to set up a new one to start again. But this is the battle that we're facing. And I'm very careful about the guests I bring on my show. I'm very careful about the information we share on the episodes, because all I'm looking for is for answers to questions. But there are certain questions that we can't publicly ask, it seems.
Yeah, and I apologise now for actually bringing those subjects up.
Not at all. Not at all. I don't want to self-censor because of the situation, because that becomes a bigger problem. That's exactly what's happening. There are plenty of smart people like you, Norman, who probably see the world in the same way that you do, but are afraid to speak out. I saw a tweet about that today.
That's absolutely it, and they're completely silenced. But the ones who want to, as I say, the ones who want to push the narrative, and there really are a lot of them, unfortunately, in academia. I'd like to say there's a silent majority like us, but actually it isn't. We are a silent minority, of whom there's an even smaller minority who are actually prepared to speak out about it, because the rest have seen what happens to those who do, as you say, stick their head above above the parapet. They become essentially persona non grata within academia, and they're sort of forever discredited.
Yeah, well, I think there's a short-term pain for a long-term gain with this situation, because I mean, I was joking with my team today. She was like, she says you get more predictions right than Mystic Meg. You know, Mystic Meg's probably not a good example, but you know, the amount of things when you can start to see patterns in data and you can start to see trends. It's been one of my gifts throughout my adult life, is being able to spot patterns and as a result kind of see the trajectory of things. The amount of things that I've been able to predict 2, 3, 4, 6, 12 months in because of those patterns has been unbelievable. But what happens at the time, if you say anything about it, it's like, oh, no, that's definitely not happening. That's misinformation, that's disinformation, conspiracy. And then later it materializes to be true. And there has been certain things that have even the press have U-turned on. So yeah, I asked the question: what point during the analysis of a novel virus, novel simply means new, do we decide that the science is settled? You know, it blows my mind. But you're absolutely right. You know, there are people who are afraid of speaking. I retweeted someone today, a doctor who said, I don't recall, I'll quote this, I've got it on the screen, I don't recall ever speaking with so many people who are afraid that they will lose their jobs if they say out loud what they're actually thinking, or if they refuse to accept something they firmly believe they should decline. This is really not good for a free society. And I had to retweet that. It's been retweeted thousands of times today, because at some point, and I do come across some fantastic professors, academics, people from all walks of life who are questioning the narrative, but quietly so. But they are afraid of losing their jobs. And interestingly, the ones that do speak up are the ones that aren't reliant on institutional money.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be perfectly frank. You know, I mean, if I'm at, let's say, a very mature stage of my career, if I was, if I was 20 years younger, I guess, and wanted to continue in academia or senior role in academia, I probably wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing.
The challenge here, though, Norman, is that because there are so many people feeling the same but suppressing themselves, it just takes that little, you know, there's that video, I share it quite frequently, of the person dancing. I don't think it was Glastonbury, but it looked like Glastonbury. The person dancing on the hill by themselves. They're having a great time dancing away, and everyone thinks they're great dancing away by themselves. But then someone else comes and dances with them, and then someone else comes and dances, and all of a sudden there's a party. You know, there's a whole group of people dancing away. It takes that person to courageously dance alone, and we've seen those people come forward. You were one of them, you know. But as we do so, we start to gather a crowd. But the problem is, we're still at the point where there is only a handful of, or a small selection of lone dancers. Now that is changing, but with these people who are seeing what we see, but are still sat on the sidelines, it just takes a few more of them to come forward to then give everyone confidence to say, okay, well, now enough's enough. Now I can speak up, because then it's a misperception that this is the minority view. It really is, particularly when you look at some hard principles around the data, as we've talked about today.
Yeah, well, I think there's an opportunity here. I mean, on a positive note, I think that if we hammer home the message that I think that mass testing of healthy people is not just distorting the case data and prolonging the crisis, but is incredibly futile and inefficient. And then the whole industry of testing and track and trace that goes along with that is costing taxpayer billions. I think that's kind of like that's important low-hanging fruit for us, because despite all the censorship, I think there's a growing public awareness of that point. And the fact that such testing, for example, is pumping up the cost of travel abroad is really making people wake up, especially as they experience firsthand what a scam most of the testing is. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a similar opportunity for public awareness with regard to the vaccine passport, which, despite all the promises, is coming, right? I mean, I think that could be challenged, you know, not just on the obvious things of invasive medical apartheid. It goes against all principles of civil liberties and personal responsibilities and all that stuff. But the fact that people are now seeing that actually even those who've been double vaccinated won't have a valid vaccine passport unless they continue to get, you know, the booster jabs. I think this is waking people up, because they can see everybody now can see that there's something ineffective and illogical about this whole this whole thing, because we know that vaccinated people can still contract and transmit the virus. And we also know that unvaccinated people with antibodies, are more likely to be immune and unable to transmit the virus than the vaccinated. So I think these are the areas where, let's say us in this community, if we keep hammering those messages home, I think that can get really widespread. There's really widespread sympathy with those views, and that can blow the whole thing apart.
Well, I share your optimism. I'm ever optimistic. My concern is, as always, there are giant levers that the government and the media can pull. The variant lever. I mean, that one is already the hand is firmly gripped on that one, ready for this winter, and it just puts people back into fear. And the reality is, we've seen some unusual patterns of the virus over the course of the summer, and we perhaps may talk about that in terms of seasonality and what may have led to that. But we also know that there is a natural pattern of ill health during the winter season. And my fear is, that the levers are going to start being pulled. And I can honestly say my prediction this winter is that there'll be the emergence of a new variant, which is almost inevitable, and that will be used alongside the small percentage of people who are unvaccinated to say that lockdowns are necessary. They'll never concede that the vaccines have been ineffective against the variants. They'll blame the variant, they'll blame the unvaccinated, and then all of a sudden there's no other solution. So we fall back to lockdowns, and it's under those conditions. Although you're absolutely right, I do share your positive sentiment. It keeps people suppressed. It just keeps people back in that zone of fear. And we've seen how easy it is to keep people there. But I do share your optimism, and I do hope that people will start to see with common sense that this doesn't make sense. I mean, just looking at Israel has been touted all over social media and the press as a COVID hotspot right now. They have one of the highest vaccination rates, full stop, in the world, and they've also triple vaccinated. I think close to 26% of their population, triple vaccinated, 26, a quarter of their population. So surely where people are going to start to ask questions, surely people are going to say this doesn't add up. But the problem, I think, Norman, here is, even if it doesn't add up, what's the answer? How do we move forward? How do we get out of this? Because we can't live in a perpetual state of lockdowns.
Well, the trouble is, as you say about it, it's the government levers. They can. I mean, the biggest lever of all that really kind of if you stopped any dissent, as it were, was the incredibly generous furlough scheme. People being paid to stay at home ensures that people are kind of comfortable with the lockdowns. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people looking forward to a winter lockdown if they're going to get the same kind of furlough scheme delivered to them. So it's a problem. But what is the way out? I mean, the problem is, I think interrogating the official data is largely a waste of time because of all the limitations we've discussed. I mean, we maybe got to demand possibly using freedom of information requests. Some of the data that we've said should be available. Maybe that's the way, to do it. I think we've got to just, totally separate this, to get totally separate data on asymptomatics v symptomatic cases, because, we aren't seeing, even with the variant, we're not seeing any significant increase in deaths, and we know that many of the hospitalizations and deaths, we're almost certain are not because of the variant or because of COVID. It's because of these other comorbidities. But ultimately, I think that I think we have to have the proper cost-benefit analysis of lockdowns, right? And what we can do is maybe people with particular interest, so people interested in, let's say, impact on health or impact on employment or impact on civil liberties, impacts on family cohesion. You can look at any of those, and if you can get the data to show what the negative effects are. Of course, all the other negative health impacts, the loss of appointments, missed cancer cases, and all the likes. Once you collect proper data on all of those and get what I think would be overwhelming evidence of the costs, the risks against the benefits of future lockdowns, that should do the trick.
You'd hope so. You'd hope so. again, I'm skeptical. I think with data in place of what feels like an ideological position, they're two separate arguments. You know, it's trying to win an ideological argument with rational logic, and it just feels like it's gone beyond rational logic. But you know, you're absolutely right. I would love to. I mean, I would love to just sit down in front of the Sage Group and say, let's talk through this. Let's put, and I do believe we ought to put, I think we do need to put the burden of proof. I've talked about this here on the podcast before. The burden of proof on the Sage advisors, on the government, because we've had 6.8 million positive tests in the UK registered. That's 10% of the population have had a positive test. But we don't know how many of those went on to have symptoms. We don't know how many had no symptoms. We don't know how many were treated in a hospital because they were symptomatic purely so. We don't know how many of those went on to sadly die. We just don't know. And that is just ridiculous. Like in order to actually assess how we move forward, surely we have to go back to first principles and say, well, what is the reality here? And what do we need to do urgently to figure that out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I hope we can do that. You know, thank you, Norman, for an enlightening conversation. You know, there's been some amazing comments throughout this, and thank you for being here today. Apologies for the slight delay in getting started to everyone who watched this live. You know, there's been a couple of things that have been touched upon today. Norman has a blog. You can go to normanfenton.com, isn't that right?
Yeah, you can get to the blog from there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and we talked about vaccine passports. Now, if you're interested in rejecting vaccine passports, you think they're an erosion of our liberties and rights and discriminatory measure that's going to expand the inequalities within society, creating a two-tier society where millions of people will be precluded from accessing society. If you want to stand against that so that we can eat, dance, and learn and play together, please sign the Together Declaration at togetherdeclaration.org. Add your voice to that important cause. So that we can remain in somewhat of a liberal democracy. Norman, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. Thank you for all the hard work that you're doing. Please do check out Norman's Twitter account. What's your Twitter handle, Norman?
Prof N Fenton.
Prof N Fenton. Please do follow Norman for constant updates on these types of discussions. And thank you to our podcast listeners who have tuned in live here to the Pandemic Podcast. I did mention that we'll probably get banned on YouTube for strike for talking about ivermectin and vaccines. And on that point, please do make sure you just take 1 minute of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic to subscribe to our mailing list so we can keep you up to date with fantastic interviews like this one. I've got some very, very big interviews coming up in September. You won't want to miss them. So please do join our mailing list to make sure you don't miss out. Thank you again, Norman, and thank you to everyone who listened live. And we'll see you again tomorrow evening for our latest broadcast on the Pandemic Podcast.
Thanks.